Welcome to the Hedgineer Podcast with your hosts, Michael Watson and Jhanvi Virani.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another epic episode of the Hedgineer Podcast. Today we have a special guest, Brett Caughran, founder of Fundamental Edge, is going to come on the show, and we're going to go back and forth on how he's seeing AI play out within the research process. But before we do that, got our co-host back on the show, Jhanvi Virani, and we're going to go over what's new with AI over the last week. So Jhanvi, what's going on?
A lot, as always. But I wanted to start the show talking about what we were talking about in the Uber ride here, which was a really cool project that we've been working on with one of our clients. And I'm not going to give away too much. I'd love for you to kind of dive into it. But it's a really interesting kind of case study of how AI has enabled some of the more senior members of the client firms that we work with to start building things like their engineers, or they had a team of engineers, which was really interesting.
Yeah. So one of the things that we focus a lot on, and I mean, you know this as well as anyone, is a skill library that includes best in class practice from research workflows, back office, middle office workflows, but also like the engineering and technical workflows. Which include things like how do you build a Databricks pipeline? How do you quarantine records that aren't resolving to your security master? How do you test in a dev sandbox the entire pipeline, cloning from production, but do it in a way that it's not actually messing anything in production, and then make a PR that does all of that, have Claude review the PR. The same thing that if you were to be a data engineer within an asset manager of like what best practices of onboarding a new data set look like, and opposed to defining all of that in a code base, like defining that in a skill, and then letting an end user that's not as technical start vibe coding a new feature that might be a production data pipeline. So at one of our clients, we had their CFO. It's probably been in the industry for like 20, 30 years now, understands the operational side of a business. He's never, I think, written code up until maybe 2 or 3 months ago. And so what we do is we have him a fully curated skill library that guides his Claude Code instance to be able to think and operate like a senior engineer, because we had our senior engineers create those skills for him. But then he articulates what the requirements are that he wants for a new data set to come into the entire data platform. And he has to define something like it's called open spec. It's like an open format for how you define requirements. And then if he doesn't specify what he's trying to do as accurately as the system needs, Claude pushes back and says, no, actually, can you describe a little bit more on how you're thinking about resolving this to a company, or how you're thinking about the time series elements of it, until it passes that requirements for that open spec. And then just presses go, builds the pipeline, runs the tests, iterates on it. And you can see all of our skills being pulled in, like data architect, data pipeline, data quality check, as it's going through building that pipeline. And then at the end of that, he builds this beautiful PR. It was a lot of different changes, and includes like Terraform spec changes, sizing up the data warehouse cluster, all the specific business logic of modifying the tables, bronze, silver, gold, all that stuff. He doesn't know any of that underlying complexity. All as he knows, like, oh, passes. I can see the end data when I write a simple query. And Claude in the PR review does a full checkout. He then makes the PR short for pull request for people that aren't as familiar with code, and Claude Auto improves it, pushes it to production. Our engineer, he also did approve it, made sure that it went through, but he just kind of it passes the test. And it all happened under an hour. And being able to enable a COO or a CFO of a billion-dollar hedge fund that has not written code before to add to their data platform by doing a full data pipeline at a very high level with high quality data checks, and onboard a new data set into their data platform in an hour is awesome. And it was kind of cool to go through all right, well, yeah, I'll use the data architect skill, or use the data engineering skill. Oh, we did the quarantine table. Oh, it used the ephemeral storage where we spin up compute and take a clone of production, run it in a staging environment, verify everything goes through, delete that once it's done testing, make the PR, see Claude do the whole PR. And it's lovable, but for data infrastructure in an opinionated way for an asset manager with the actual guardrails that you want. And it was awesome. It was just like a full validation of like everything that we've been pushing on from the skill perspective, combining great technology that oftentimes that you forget is still important when you go and start vibe coding. Which I'm actually like, nobody's more bullish on vibe coding and skill definition, defining your workflows within AI than me. But it was kind of cool to see that go end to end. And yeah, that was just like one thing of millions that have kind of happened over the course of the last week. Because there's like Opus just released 4.8 today. Workflows came out. Private MCP tunnels to be able to have more secure exposure to your data within Anthropic. Role-based access controls for MCP connectors. There's been like a ton of industry-wide rollouts with new features within Claude. But yeah, it was cool. It was a fun kind of chatting about that on the way here. We figured why not talk about it on the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a lot of ways, the skill library that we're building out for all of our clients represents this like deconstructed approach to how we think about workflows and automating them. Like I was talking to one of our other clients this afternoon, and I was like, the most challenging part about automating workflows, he's a COO, automating workflows on like the operation side or the fundamental research side is not necessarily even building the agent or building the skill or building the underlying technology that supports them. It's about reflecting on your process in a very thoughtful way and being able to deconstruct it into these very simple building blocks that you can automate in piecemeal, and then automate the process in which those different pieces string together into a workflow. And that is really challenging. Like it's not a technical problem. It's almost like a philosophical one. And so I think that this approach that you're describing to me is like a perfect embodiment of that philosophy, where we're not going to build a data pipeline. We're not even going to build a single skill to build a data pipeline. We're going to build skills around the pieces of the motions that one goes through to build a pipeline. So it is, okay, understanding the underlying tech architecture of this database, making sure that whenever a new PR is submitted, it passes a specific, very rigorous list of things. The data quality checks meet a specific standard, and that requires writing probably hundreds of lines of English language in the form of a skill of what a good data quality check really means. And then also being thoughtful in where you need to give the LLM some room to actually reason and breathe. There is a risk in being too explicit, because then you're the same way that you are overfitting a model, you're also overfitting the LLM's ability to kind of use the inference and reasoning that it does so well. And so, yeah, it's a really interesting use case, and I think it's just one of many that will continue popping up over the course of the next several months as everyone starts thinking about their workflows in a more thoughtful way and seeing what they can turn those thoughts into.
Totally. And we want to be in a position where we can help the construction of the tokens when a user's using Claude or Cowork or Chat or ChatGPT to be able to inject tokens into their prompts when they're sending it to the LLM, or have the LLM be able to like pull in additional tokens that help better scope and structure the problem they're trying to solve. Because like in that example, they're like, hey, like I want to onboard this new, let's say, credit card data set. And they just describe what they want of capabilities, but then we can use skills to interject. Well, when you onboard the new credit card data set, we always use a medallion model. This is how you define like the bronze table, which is raw, unstructured. The silver, this is how we want to tag that to our security master. And the gold is how we might want to have that in a final view that somebody else can query in a downstream process. Now, we want ultimately all of that context to get to the language model, but we don't want that user have to do any more work than what's necessary in order to make sure that that happens. And so that's a way in which we can inject really good context. Like ultimately this gets turned into tokens to augment what they're trying to accomplish in a very unintrusive way, leveraging all of the best practices that Anthropic and ChatGPT and the industry are starting to coalesce around, so that when they're using AI in any of the tools within their internal AI deployment, the tokens that are being constructed are getting better and better and better, and they're including expertise beyond just the expertise they have. Like, in the way that we're solving this right now is with the skills. What's really cool on the observability layer that we build is that when we start watching what's happening when a user's building out that pipeline or they're building out their investment memo, we can identify, well, what skills actually were used, what tools were being called, what prompts were they entering in, and what additional data was being assembled in order to get the results of the memo or the Excel model or the piece of research that they're producing, and then take a step back, evaluate how they got there, and is there a better way in order to get to that memo? And if there is, what can we do to accomplish it? And we basically break it down in 3 ways. So you can change the user's behavior, which is mainly changing the prompt structure. Like, how do they better articulate what they're trying to accomplish? You could change the knowledge of the system, which can be a skill, a change of a skill, a rewording of a skill, or attach on a memory store that can include information that the system should be able to draw on as it's trying to solve for this workflow. Or you change the tool. And so like you could add an MCP server, or you can modify an MCP server that gives the system better information and context to data as it's trying to solve for that problem. And then what we're doing, again, is that the system is constructing that context, assembling those tokens in order to better enable the LLM to help a user without them doing anything. Like they're not changing their behaviors that much, but it's the system that is changing automatically based off of observing what's working and what's not. And it's been amazing to kind of see that thing come to life. And people have been asking me like about Hedgineer and what we do. And one of the things I've been describing is like we're token builders for our clients. Like our job is to make sure that the tokens, and when I say tokens, like you type in a prompt, ultimately that gets tokenized, gets turned into a vector of integer, event, or digits, and that gets what's sent to the model. And the model then looks at these tokens and then predicts what's the next best token. And our job, if you were to say from a technical perspective, is to make sure that the tokens that our clients are passing to their LLM provider is the best combination of tokens possible. And we're only going to get better and better tokens over time as we learn more based off of like what's working and what's not. And being in a position where we can help our clients always have the best tokens when they're interacting with their ChatGPT Enterprise or Claude Enterprise environment, and doing that through training, doing that through building systems, engineering workflows, defining skill libraries, helping them define those skill libraries with AI it's been awesome. It's been absolutely awesome.
Yeah. I was talking with one of the newer members of our team. He's been here for 6 weeks now, a little bit more than 6 weeks now. And I was catching up with him and he was like, I feel like AI can do a lot, but I keep running into this experience where I pass in a prompt for some sort of engineering task. I ask Claude Code to put together a plan, and I feel like the plan is always like over-engineered, not something that I would think of myself, and sometimes I grow frustrated. And I think this is a story that is very common amongst engineers that go from whatever job that they were in to a more AI-focused company and a business. And I was like, the thing that you need to remember about AI, like it's getting better all the time, but it's very easy to forget that the entire purpose of an LLM in its simplest form is to predict the most probabilistically high next token. And so by definition, it will always revert to average, right? Like if it's trained off of tons of training data around what coding really is on the open internet, it will if you have a large distribution of data, it'll always revert to average. And so if you just pass in a prompt asking Claude Code to do something and you don't provide it with the additional context around what the best practices of Python development is within your firm, or what the best standards are around building data pipelines at your firm, or the best way to handle Terraform changes within your firm. If you're not supplementing the LLM with all of that additional context, its response will be average. And so I think that in a lot of ways, skills, subagents, and all of the work that we do with our clients is really just taking that average and moving it further and further to the right and making it better as a function of providing context of what good looks like within that firm. And that's really all. It's not a simple thing, but from a purely conceptual angle, it is a very straightforward concept. It's just, can we supplement whatever you were asking the LLM with context that makes it significantly better than average?
Totally.
And that's it.
And like building on that, being aware of the role of context in the influence of what the LLM is going to do, I think is a really important concept that you have to grasp in order to control that next token prediction. And a lot of the tools that we use, they make context management so abstract that it's very easy to have context bloats without even realizing it. And where that oftentimes happens is when you go and produce a narrative or a memo or unstructured written data, whether it's a research report, and being unable to produce something that actually looks like what you would normally phrase it as, how you would normally write it. And where I see that happening, like, one, that's not easy to do. I'm not saying it's easy to do, but what I think a lot of people don't realize is that the context that they have when they go and write research is including all of the information gathering that they had to go through in order to get to the point where they're writing, and never actually passing that context off and the actual insights and the learning to another agent session. And right now I'm talking about Claude Code or Claude in general. But the same thing is true in most ChatGPT or anything where it's session management. Just start fresh with new context and just the insights and access to citations that you want to include, and then control what the narrative, tone, and objective is. Because if you think about like the common workflow when you're using Claude Code to write on a research report, you're doing, let's say, a bunch of web searches, and you're pulling a bunch of MCP servers together. You're maybe reading unstructured documents. You're parsing them. You're coming up with some insights. And there might be hundreds of thousands of tokens that are all writing big complex code, pulling down APIs, assembling all of this information in order to get to your research process. And all of that context is carried with you at the very end when you just suddenly say, okay, now I want you to write a research report. And you think that, oh, you should just write a really good research report, but you're not realizing that the actual prompt that's being sent to the LLM at that point is hundreds, sometimes thousands of lines of code, messy web queries, messy web result searches, including also the system prompt that exists. And then this little tiny section that says, okay, now let's write a research report, write it in my like normal tone, try to be very specific, include these 3 different sections, and thinking that the model is just going to ignore the thousands of other crap context that exists there and be able to write the exact voice that you want. And then they get the results. Like, oh, it's really hard to write research. For me, it's building on what you were just saying, is that not realizing how the context window is actually being managed when going to try to write research, and waiting till like the very last minute when you've done all of this research, you're still forcing that into context, and then expecting it to write a perfect narrative and also keep all of this historical crap in context. And of course, it's not going to work. So how do you do that? You separate into separate sessions, either with a sub-agent, or you write down an overview of just the research content, not with narrative form, but just citations in the information. Start a brand new context from there that has access to pull in this data, where the actual focus of that session is just on writing narrative, just writing the investment memo with a specific objective and structure of an investment memo. And then pull in just the data that you need, but don't inject how you actually had to do all of that rough, messy research into context, because that's how you end up with narratives that look like trash at the very end of a session. But you feel like you don't have control, but you don't have control because you haven't actually taken control of the context. And so in the same way that we're talking about understanding the role of context and tokens that are being used to get better coding results or be able to get better planning, where if you don't tell it what you want in your Terraform spec, it's not going to do the Terraform spec in the way that you want. It might even choose to do it in Terraform. Or you don't tell it how you want your actual API written with fast API, it's not going to write it in the way that you want. It's going to revert back to average. The same way that if you tell it how all of this like unnecessary like research data and how you actually want to get there, and then you wanted to solve something completely separate, it's the same problem for me, is mirrored in the fact that people aren't controlling the context window in which they're using AI. Oftentimes because the tools make it so easy to completely forget about what context is being passed. When you always go back to that from a first principles perspective and say that you have to own your own context and understand what is and is not being passed to the LLM, regardless of what agentic harness tool you're using, Claude Code, Codex, Gemini CLI, Open Code, Claude Cowork, that you're never going to feel like you're in control because you're not controlling your context. When you feel like you're in control of your context, that is when you feel like you're in control of the AI. And once you get that, once you grasp that, then you're able to make objective decisions on what AI can and cannot do for you. And I'm always impressed that it can do a lot more than I believe that it can, as long as I'm able to have control of my context. And that is always critical.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. But as you're saying that, like, a lot of times I don't feel like I'm in control of my context because I work in these platforms like Claude Cowork where I don't really have a say in how context is managed, right? Like for example, I use Cowork projects, and I use them because Anthropic says that if you organize sessions around themes, projects save important context around those projects over time and creates this kind of living memory within those subset of sessions. And I have yet to see any benefits from these projects, but I'm still kind of just doing it in the hopes that it'll eventually get better. But I think that as they're pushing out more of these features, I think that, like you mentioned at the very beginning, like the grasp of what is actually within your context window is starting to get more and more vague and opaque and difficult to discern. Like, for example, one of the most common kind of funny glitches of LLMs is that since it's always trying to guess the next token, oftentimes when you are referencing a person by their first name, the LLM will try to guess the last name. Like oftentimes you'll put together a prompt and you reference someone and then it puts together this document and it just puts a random last name at the end. I'm sure you've seen that. I see that all the time. And so when that happens, I don't really think twice about it. But there was this time where I was noticing like every single time I'm putting together a sales or marketing doc, your last name is Schulman every single time. And I was like, okay, that means that there's something somewhere saved in my account, because there's no way that it would just guess that same last name every single time. And so then I dug into my settings and I dug into my memory, and it said Michael Schulman in there as one of the coworkers that I work with. And so that's why I was always guessing your last name as that. So I was able to fix it. But I was like, first of all, I don't think that 99% of people would even notice that happened and take the time to fix it. But two, memory is just one dialog box within a vast array of context management functions and tools that Claude is using underneath the hood that I can't even change. It just happened to be in a place that I can change, but there's probably tons of context associated with my account that I have no ability to change.
Totally. One thing, if you are in Claude Code and you see it doing something that you're suspicious on context injection that is not something that you wanted, you can fork the session and essentially clone, ask Claude to introspect itself and say like, hey, why are you adding the name Michael Schulman into this session when that's clearly incorrect? And then Claude can go through its entire context and it's like, yeah, I have this from a memory that you're Michael Schulman. I can see now that shouldn't be the case.
Actually, I think that's exactly what I did in Cowork. I was like, why'd you pick Schulman? And then it said, I have it in my memory. Yeah. And so that's how I was able to figure it out.
The reason why I said fork is because sometimes when you're in the flow within Claude Code, you don't want to inject this self-reflection into the session. And so if you can just keep the session state as is and then ask it this question, answer it, go and resolve it, and then it's like, okay, well, let's go and Claude resume the other session. It allows you to go back into the flow, but maybe fix that for next time without having this weird moment when Claude had to self-reflect on itself that could cause maybe some weird things to happen later on in the flow. It's a way to be able to just do a quick fork, evaluate session state, and then go back to the previous state without having to worry about having to start a new session altogether.
Yeah, Cowork doesn't have forking yet, which is a bummer. But they did launch a feature a couple of weeks ago where you could reference past conversations. So maybe that would also potentially work.
Yeah, like I'm convinced co-work and code will eventually align. Like I should be able to go into co-work and then spin up one of the windows that I can get with Claude Code and have a Claude Code session directly within co-work. Like I shouldn't have to tab over to the other view. I should be able to get a window to a terminal alongside the rest of the Claude co-work environment, working within the same project. And so if I wanted to then switch into code, go back to co-work, and have both of those things work in the same window, like that's trivial. Like there's nothing actually complex about that. I think what will be really cool is when you start allowing the window to be able to view maybe the progress status on Claude Code. I think one of the things they've rolled out also today that's been in private preview for a little bit is workflows, where you can create a DAG of agents. DAG is short for directed acyclic graph. People that are familiar with data engineering, it's common within like Airflow or Prefect. Databricks has their own DAG structures. And then N8N has like a DAG-like structure. Lane graph, it's inherently a graph. The G within DAG is graph. And so it's been there for a while. But now Claude Code has its own graph structure with workflows where you can deterministically define what are these multi-agent structures like. And I think that they've added on to the Claude Code CLI the ability to list out agents, similar to you can list out sessions. And I think as people start doing more complex work from the CLI with these DAGs, that you're going to want more UX around it. Like you need more UX even right now with workflows to be able to visualize it, see the current state of the different agents. It's very natural to move that to desktop. And you already have a lot of the nice UX of looking at like task status within CoWork on the top right. And being able to see the flat files and the skills. Like there's a nice UX component of being able to see like how this agent harness has been configured. You're going to need something similar with workflow to be able to see this different, like this DAG-like structure and the execution of it. And the CoWork UX is kind of perfect for that. And so I see like as you push more and more agents into code, that the CoWork UX, where you're not as involved in the code directly, is going to be a very natural way that you have to deal with these agents, because you can't look at all of the code for each one at a time. You kind of have to somewhat vibe your way through agent management. And so doing that through the CoWork like UX is like the only way that you can manage these agents, even if you want to see the code directly. And so I do see a merging happening eventually with the code and code work. It will be very simple to be able to add in like a little window panel that has the snapping ability of just seeing a Claude Code session within CoWork. And so I see those two worlds blending together. We are also working with like one of the clients and thinking through like what is their CoWork strategy? Like can they push more code to a large technical audience? And what does that look like? And I'm hearing a lot of like I personally have been a big fan of Cursor for a while. Like as much as I push the Claude ecosystem and Claude Code, what Cursor is doing is awesome. And like the speed of the agentic loop with Composer 2 is excellent. The way that they're building agent management frameworks and agent fleets for having cross-team sharing. I've talked to a couple fundamental PMs that have now switched over to Cursor, and they're saying like, dude, I love Cursor. If I had to choose between CoWork and Cursor, like Cursor is awesome. And then code, you need some sort of IDE plugin, like the VS Code plugin, to really feel like you own the code, unless you're really just living in the terminal. And so, yeah, I think like the agentic tool and framework is still really up for grabs, but the CoWork code merging is definitely something that I see like it needs to be done in the near term, because you can't manage workflows with Claude Code just from the terminal once it starts scaling up in complexity for the DAG.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the main blocker would be like design and user experience. I think that tools like Cursor and Claude Code have the advantage of being primarily catered towards developers, and therefore they can build more complex concepts around familiar ideas, right? Like I think forking sessions is a really good example. You can fork branches in Git. Developers are very familiar with this concept of forking, where you have a specific type of, I don't know, conversation or like code change or whatever, and then you essentially fork it and have a separate version of that you can make modifications to while keeping. It's a very common concept in version control that all developers are familiar with, and therefore being able to launch a feature like forking sessions doesn't require a ton of design and thought, right? But if you wanted to introduce that kind of concept to non-technical people for the first time, there needs to be some level of like user experience and user design that's somewhat novel. And so in a lot of ways, I see the way that Anthropic is pushing out features to both Code and Cowork is Code is a battleground where they can push out new features much faster because they have an audience that's much more forgiving when it comes to like user experience and design, because everything's around the CLI, like the command line interface. And then with Cowork, I think we need to think through the user experience in a much more thoughtful way before we codify it. And I can see that in the way that the speed in which features roll out in Cowork is just significantly slower than Code, even though underneath the hood, we know it's very, very similar technology, right? So walk me through some of the other updates that you were talking about around Claude. You mentioned Opus, you mentioned a couple other things around MCP. What were the things outside of workflows that were the most interesting to you?
I mean, it's not a major one, but role-based access control directly within Claude AI for MCP servers. And so you can control who can and can't have access to an MCP server across an enterprise organization. Like,
I think that's huge.
Yeah, like you can, within the MCP server itself, you do authentication and authorization. And so like the MCP server provider can limit what a user can have, but at an org level, being able to say who can and can't access this in generally and be able to whitelist this, it gives you a little bit more control of that, the context window. So that's a big one. The rollout of MCP tunnels, so that you can have direct VPC to Anthropic access that's completely encrypted. Like right now, if you want to use the messages API and have that API have access to your MCP server or the agent management within Anthropic have access to your MCP server, you have to, that access goes over the open internet. There's ways that you can secure it. So you basically allow your MCP server to have a limited access for outbound requests or inbound requests to the specific IPv4 range that is Anthropic's exclusive IP range. And so you say, IP ranges outside of this can't have access to your MCP server, so you can lock it down. But what they're now enabling you to do is a private tunnel that's just encrypted between you and Anthropic. So it's a more secure way to expose MCP servers to the Anthropic environment. What else did we get this week? There was, honestly, I think that's all that can come to mind at the moment. But it's like every single week there's like new features, and like staying on top of it is not a full-time job, but it's like a part-time job. It's
honestly,
not
I feel like
trivial.
this podcast has become a forcing function for us to stay more on top of things than ever.
I know. Like I'm messaging Daniel. I was like, hey man, what am I missing here? I know there's got to be something that they've released this week. And there's always like the bug releases that they push out. Like last week they pushed out changes to the Claude Code runtime so that if you have environment variables that start with the prefix OTEL, they're removed from the environment to be able to reference within a hook. And so we had a lot of special OTEL collector environment variables that we were using to route within the hooks to our OTEL collector after a tool call that we wanted to get additional observability and understand what was going on. And they just changed that, and we didn't catch it until like a day later. And so there's obviously the feature-related requests or the feature-related releases, but then there's all of these like either, I wouldn't say a bug, but like these undocumented changes when they're moving so fast that when you're trying to always stay kind of at the bleeding edge and using everything that they're rolling out with, sometimes you get a little burnt and you're trying to play catch up, but we do a pretty good job of trying to at least not fall behind so our clients don't fall behind either.
Yeah. And so on that note, let's take a quick break and then come back with Brett. I was super bummed that I wasn't able to join the session, but I did listen to it earlier this week, and I think it's one of the most interesting conversations we've had in a really long time. So I'm super excited for listeners to listen in. Something that I hear pretty consistently from executive leaders in this space is that they see value in AI, but there's no clear path to actually adopting it. Most providers, whether it's the frontier models like Claude and OpenAI, or the platforms being built on top of them, they hand you a product and they leave you to figure out whether it works for your workflows and how. And at Hedgineer, we take a very different approach.
And we're able to because we have industry experience to not just understand investment process in the abstract, but to know how a fund actually operates, where information is sourced, how it moves through a team, what synthesis happens before a decision gets made. Once we understand that, we can build custom connectors in a data platform that connects all your data directly into Claude or OpenAI. Bloomberg, your primes, your internal models, your internal research notes, whatever you're actually using.
And then we deploy our platform on top of that. Think of it as a command center that sits on top of your Claude or OpenAI account. You can see every agent at your disposal, both the personal ones that you've built for yourself, as well as the org-wide ones that are maintained by your company. You can ask them to do things on demand directly within the application, or you could schedule reoccurring tasks that have them running in the background and having them send you the results straight to you via Slack or email.
And we also track usage at the firm over time, so leadership can see where AI is working, where it isn't, and surface opportunities to go deeper.
And we run training sessions with your team on Claude, on the platform, and even how to prompt and build skills better. So the competency builds internally and it sticks over time.
So if you're interested in learning more about how we can help your fund become AI native, shoot us an email at info@hedgineer.io. I'm buying what they're selling. Now let's continue the conversation with Brett and I. See you, Jhanvi. We have Brett Caughran, founder, CEO of Fundamental Edge, here on the podcast today. And we're going to be talking about the role of AI within fundamental research and what that process looks like now as we kind of go into the second half of 2026 and how he kind of got into the being a bit of a thought leader in the space that he is today. So tons of topics to come on. Brett, super excited to have you on the show.
Awesome. Thanks. That's a super cringy thing to call myself a thought leader. So I'll reject that. But it's been a fun space to sort of learn with our community, and it's a super exciting time right now.
For sure. I mean, would you rather be a thought leader or an influencer?
I'll go with influencer. That sounds great.
Oh, you would? Okay, got it. Yeah. The influencer, man. You need to let the zipper down a little bit further.
No, exactly. So yeah, thanks a lot for having me.
Of course, man. So I think one of the things that I've always been impressed with is how you've been able to engage such a large audience, like in Twitter, and have a diverse set of early stage career analysts trying to figure out how they can make their way in the industry, but also industry vets all kind of looking at you to describe what a good process looks like. And that's not easy to do, to be such an appeal to a large audience. What is it that I think that you've been able to articulate that appeals to a new college grad as well as an industry vet, all thinking about how we can continue to improve within the fundamental equity or just fundamental investment space?
Yeah, I think it starts with just the experience I had as an investor. I was really fortunate to start my career at Maverick, which had an incredibly rigorous and almost scientific process to the fundamental research process. I was a blank page starting there. I spent a year as a banker and didn't know anything. So I sort of sopped that in and then had the opportunity to work at very different sorts of funds, multi-strategy quant fund, a multi-strategy fund. And so I think one of the insights I had across 5 different funds, which by the way, it's not good if you work at 5 different funds. So I had a good career, the best investors stay at one fund. So I did some things the right way and the wrong way. But I think what I identified through that lived experience is 80 to 85% of what most funds are doing is pretty standardized from a process perspective. There are tweaks, et cetera. And it's again sort of hubristic to call it best practices, but I've tried to sort of articulate over time what good is from an investment process perspective. And I just thought a lot about teaching and training that. A lot of it started, I partnered with a quant fund in 2018 to help train their machines on how fundamental investors act for the subatomic process. So I think, when I started tweeting, I forget it was 2020, 2021, when what I'd always notice is like there's nothing, there's no good textbook on how to be a hedge fund analyst.
Sure.
Like you land at Citadel or Millennium, et cetera. Like it's like figure it out, like sink or swim culture. Hopefully you have a good mentor, but there's no textbook on how to do that. So I think it's mostly just a gap of not that great of information out there, and a lot of young people wanting to learn how to do the job. So I think that's why, that's why people paid attention. We obviously run an analyst academy, which is sort of designed to be an outsourced analyst academy that has hedge fund style rigor, similar to what you would get at a hedge fund in terms of rigorous training processes. So I think that's been, it's sort of like a super niche thing, but something I've been passionate about. It's been fun to build the community. I think with the more senior investors, I've tried to just be like candid over the years on like mistakes I've made, things I've done well, things I've not done well. And what I've found is like a lot of the potholes I stepped in through my career, bad career decisions or mistakes in the portfolio, it's like a lot of people have those same experiences too, and can sort of resonate with those experiences. So it's been fun to sort of build the community, and I've gotten more from the community we've built than I've given. So it's been great.
Totally. So what would you tell your 23-year-old self now if they were just starting out their career today?
Yeah, I think be patient. Like the number one thing I tell my 23-year-old is like, be patient. Like I was always in a hurry for the bigger bonus, the bigger career, the next decision. Like I think thinking about your career as like a 15, 20-year journey on the buy side is really important. I think I've learned a lot the hard way sometimes to just like not grasping things too tight. It's a little bit like the analogy of a golf club. If you sort of grip a golf club as tight as you can, your shot's going to go in the lake. If you just loosen up a little bit, things sort of have a way of working out a little bit better. So I think especially in public markets where like there's so much out of your control, tariffs and Iran and AI and everything that you can sort of control what you can control and do that well, but approach everything else with a little bit more of a spirit of curiosity. Sort of flow with things a little bit more. Life just is kind of like more fun that way. And it's like, hey, everything has to work out exactly this way, and if it doesn't, I'm going to fall apart. Like if you approach life like that, I've learned the hard way is like life has a way of sort of smacking side the head. Not that I'm perfect on that by any means, but be patient. Just sort of trust the journey. One of my favorite speeches came from Steve Jobs, where he explained that your life will make a lot more sense in the rearview mirror than it does while you're living it. So trying to have that perspective of, hey, everything's sort of like working for me. Like this sort of approach this with curiosity and take the next best step.
Mm-hmm. And then building on that, do you think there's different skills that 23-year-old should be learning now than maybe the skills that 23-year-old should have learned, I don't know, like 10 years ago when you were 23?
Yeah. So, I mean, certainly the world has changed immensely. I think will continue to change. I think some of the foundational skills hold of, sort of the everyone's talking about agency now. Like, what is agency? Just like that's sort of like, go-getterness of like, I'm going to figure it out. I can do things. I think has always been important in this industry for sure, where there is an entrepreneurial side. But the game is sort of in the process of changing a lot, where I think when I started the business, there was this sort of almost like 2-year apprenticeship period to evaluate if you had the raw analytical and quantitative skills to do the job. And simple things like modeling skills were a binary test on whether you could be a good investor or not at a large hedge fund. If you could not build a model, you could not do the job. And it's almost a gating factor as to whether you could continue to be employed at that firm. A lot of that's been abstracted away, or is in the process of being abstracted away, which is sort of, scary in some sense and really exciting in other ideas. Like a lot of the raw work I did in my first year on the buy side in 2008 was like pulling Nielsen data, going and spreading consensus, updating global same-store sales. There's a lot of just like raw data polling information. And so doing a good job of that was about being detail-oriented. it's not until your second, third, fourth year you get into the meat of actually applying judgment to investment situations. So the exciting part is you can get into the meat of the juicy part of the investment process much earlier now with AI tools. I think one of the things I'm learning just live as well too is just the adaptability is a really important skill, sort of understanding that things are changing rapidly across all dimensions of the economy right now. And so building your own process to sort of stay up with that and figure out what's fact, what's fiction, what's hype, what's reality, and moving in an appropriate time as the tool ecosystem evolves.
Yeah. And I think that adaptability extends regardless of what your background has been. If you're in insurance, you're in technology, you're on the investment side, like the need for adaptability right now is greater than it's ever been. And I feel the same thing when I'm thinking about how do I continue to add value from a technologist, a thought leader, when you go to think about how you build systems, deploy software within asset management. And for me, I have to keep up with what we're doing with AI. Otherwise, I immediately become a dinosaur. I become obsolete. And so there has to be an element, I think, of humility right now and a willingness to learn and a willingness to experiment and learn new things, regardless of the role that you're in. And I think that how you're describing that as adaptability is something that a 23-year-old needs or a 53-year-old needs right now is true regardless of what you're working on.
Totally.
Yeah.
I completely agree. It's such a great time to be an idea person too, which I think we both are. Where it's like, we all have these wild ideas. Like you could spin up an initial business plan. Like you could go have an hour-long conversation of, does this make sense? Does it make sense to start an Accenture for public equity consulting business? Like what would that entail? How do you do it? And I feel like you can vet and sandbox and hypothesize on ideas and then actually start to create at least the outlines of new structures so much more quickly than you can do in hours what would have taken, months before. Which is exciting.
But then like creating the incentive structure for getting people together in a room, working together on the same process.
Yeah.
Getting shared focus, I think, is challenging. Like there's something powerful that happens when you can focus on one problem with a group of other people all paying attention to the same thing and collectively working on whatever that solution is. And one of the challenges of building a business is how do you incentivize people to focus on the same thing such that they're all incentivized in the upside of like what happens when that thing exists.
Yeah.
And when everyone could kind of build their own company themselves, you can start thinking like, well, actually, like, why don't I build this myself? Then I just focus on this one thing. And so figuring out incentive structures in modern businesses is also an interesting challenge and dynamic that as much as like the AI element is a blessing, it's also a curse in other components of business formation and team dynamics and structures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I completely agree.
Yeah.
Completely agree.
It's, I was on another podcast from, the guy's name was Professor Zorro. And he's a professor of he teaches a master of finance in economics or financial engineering at Lehigh. And one of the things that we were talking about on the podcast was, and it touched a little bit on your element of adaptability, that it feels like this is actually a more natural and healthy state where the guarantee of like what you're going to be doing 5 years from now is no longer there. Like the assurance of like career sustainability, you pick a job, you're guaranteed to have it for the next like 10, 15 years was a very short window of time, I think, where like that existed in like the 20th century. But for a long period of human history, there was no guarantee of sustenance. By picking a career path, you have a social safety net. There's a guarantee that there's going to be a job for you on the other side. If you graduate college, you get a degree, you pick a big company, and you just keep doing the same thing. I think that's actually very unnatural and in some ways unhealthy.
Yeah.
Whereas it feels like now we're almost back in the jungle again. And there aren't these like big moats and safety nets and castles to go and sit behind a castle, join a company. They're going to protect you for 30 years. Your job here is safe. You just make sure that you do the water station by the well and you've not got that castle behind you. We're almost back now into the jungle.
Yeah.
where we're all trying to figure out what's around the corner, what's around that next field, what's around that next tree. Go and eat what you kill and figure it out for yourself in a way that I find that incredibly empowering and like insightful, and you feel alive right now. And it's not like we didn't always live in a jungle. It's not like there wasn't always an element of like, you can go out into the world and there are no real rules beyond like what the social contracts are going to force you into, as well as government contract, like the rules. But like, we've always been in a jungle, but now it feels like we're really in it. Like we're really in the jungle. And it's, I think, a really good thing in some ways for people to rediscover themselves.
I mean, what great news. It's like, I'll age myself by citing Office Space, the movie, but it's like, who wants to sit in an office for 30 years filling out TPS reports?
Totally, man.
The vast majority of corporate America is just like a soulless job. And yeah, I've always been a little bit more of a creative guy. Even like the process of working in a hedge fund, it's a lot of just, the quarter in the life, the same thing over and over. I'm going to the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference, into Q4 Prints, into the Barclays Conference, into, the Medicare Advantage notice. It's sort of like the same thing. It's a Groundhog Day of sorts. And after 10 years of doing it, it's like, I need a new adventure, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm looking for something new. And I feel like a lot of people feel that in their soul, that sort of call for more adventure, but they're stuck filling out TPS reports.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's been so exciting, inspiring to me. Part of the sort of fun just being on Twitter is like, people reach out. It's like, hey, I'm burned out. I've worked at this hedge fund for 10 years. I'm a big believer in AI. I want to do something. It's like, I love getting those emails. Like, what an exciting time to be a problem solver with the relevant domain knowledge. And like, to me, there's so many problems to solve.
Oh yeah.
And almost like, I'm sure you see the same, like the more I dig into like these systems, the more I'm like, oh, that's a new problem. We never really considered that problem before. So it's like, I'm starting to see like the Jevons paradox, like reality of, we'll reallocate labor, but like, man, there's so many more interesting ideas that we can sort of chase down, more problems we can solve, that the end of this sort of, few year period, like just more problems will be solved.
Oh,
the
totally.
systems we build will be so much more complex. We'll look back at what we were doing in 2026 is like incredibly simplistic.
Yes. Yeah, 100%. We were talking about it before the cameras press play, but your inbox can be inundated with all of these people saying like, hey, I have all of these problems. I need your help to solve them. And then you're in a situation when you're running a company and you're like, oh, I could solve all of these individually. Can I solve all of them collectively? And the answer oftentimes is no, right? Like, you can't solve every single problem. And so figuring out when you have an abundance of problems and you have the capacity to be able to solve each one, what is the optimization function that you execute on to be able to solve the most amount, to have the biggest impact on society as a mechanism that capture value, provide for your family, your people you work with. And it's an interesting problem to have. I can solve so many problems, but I can only solve so many problems at the same time.
I totally, you're in my head. I've been thinking about the exact same thing. No, I totally agree. I saw a tweet today. I'll give you mine. I'm sort of thinking about two. I saw a tweet that said, it's easy to make an AI lawyer. It's harder to make an AI law firm, which is like the most relevant thing I'm seeing and talking to clients now across, and you've probably seen the same thing across asset managers, hedge funds now. There are usually 2 or 3 people who are really AI pilled. They're doing crazy things in Claude Code. Transferring that to the broad investment team, actually changing how, like, easy to make an AI investor, hard to make an AI investment firm.
Yeah.
So that change management of how do you rethink with these new superpowers, how you approach the idea of generating alpha, to me, that's like the most interesting, I don't have answers to it yet, the most interesting, like, intellectual puzzle. Like, markets on their own are like this just fascinating intellectual puzzle. The idea of how you help solve that puzzle with a process, with a new team, that's sort of one of the big missions I've taken up. Like, how do you start to diffuse these things? Not necessarily build the craziest architecture with Claude Code, But how do you go to a 100-person investment firm, a 300-person investment firm, a 4,000-person investment firm, and create a new standard of investment process supported by these tools that allows better alpha generation?
Mm-hmm.
Like, to me, that's like, oh, cool. Like, maybe we can like figure that out, or
Totally.
like we can play a small piece in helping that become a reality. On the second side, on the more like the spiritual side, it's like, what about all the people who will be displaced, right? What about all the people who need to pivot, who maybe they're a junior analyst now, and they become all of a sudden they become an AI analyst? What does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
There'll be a lot of changing through this process. So we thought about on the education, and I think some of us will be reskilling side. Like, how do you support people who may not be as adaptable, may not be ready for this change through what could change on Wall Street over the next 3 to 5 years?
Totally. And on the first part, I think it's interesting how it's easy to create an AI lawyer, debatable. It's hard to create an AI law firm. And one of the things that we've done a couple large AI implementations for like a $50 billion asset manager across front, middle, back office. The single biggest tool that we have is the observability component, where you can provide individuals with AI-driven feedback based off of their usage of Claude Cowork, the tools that they're using, the prompts they're using, the skills that they're using, and where they're leaving food on the table. They're leaving like opportunities that they could have actually done that better. Or when they get frustrated, how you identify. The reason why you got frustrated is that if you actually look how you were pulling down your like risk or the fund performance, you Google searched it. And so when that search came in, it gave wrong data to the system. You didn't stop it and say, no, you actually should be using the fund analytics MCP server, but you just let it go through. And then you got like these wildly wrong answers at the end. One, you can solve that in a couple different ways. One, make sure that you're following along with the flow of execution, the work that you're doing. Two, you should have had a skill that could have referenced when to call the different MCP servers in order to correctly pull in the fund analytics and not do a Google search in this. Lastly, there's elements of like from the infrastructure side, you can have an MCP gateway that can really limit what are the tools that an individual user can have. But by being able to observe all of that and give that feedback on an individual basis to users, you start allowing that fund where they have some people that aren't familiar with AI to start getting analytics on their usage of AI automatically so they can get better. And then you also enable somebody that's more like the head of the AI implementation of the fund to get visibility on what are all of the analysts doing with AI? What are all of the different people in operations or risk doing with AI? What are the 3 biggest things you can do as being head of AI operations or implementation within your firm to move the needle the most based off of where people are getting frustrated or where there's actually really good best practices coming from a couple of the analysts to convert those to organizational skills and roll that out. And once you have that feedback loop where you get everyone using AI, you do some training, you make sure they have the right access to tools and systems, and then you start creating a framework that they can learn from by observing them and giving them feedback. You start creating that feedback loop where at first you have a couple of the lawyers, a couple of the new interns, and everyone else at that law firm not using AI effectively. But then you have a mechanism for like the people that are just trying it out. They log into Cowork or they try to use Claude.ai or they use Codex within ChatGPT. Also, it's getting much better very quickly. To get feedback like on what you could have done on that first session that actually would have made what you were trying to accomplish that much more effective. And people like, oh, actually that would have been helpful. Or like that prompt, actually, if I would have tried that would have been differently. Or maybe I will go try that new MCP server. Like, oh, that is cool that we have this skill library. I wasn't sure how to use it. And you can allow a system to meet people where they are on that AI journey. Because like your AI experts, they're deep in the weeds and they're struggling with problems that are very different than the person that's going into Cowork for the very first time and they maybe tried ChatGPT once. And creating a framework that you can help both of them. The only way that I've been able to figure that out is to make sure that you have AI solving for both of them and not having one person responsible for both of it. And it's actually been pretty transformative.
I think I totally agree. And I love the idea that you said that last night too, of just the observability and sort of feeding back in. Like one thing I really believe, is particular institutional investors, is the bar to impress with AI is very high. Why is that? Because they already know, like these investors already know their companies incredibly well, right? most investors don't need AI to summarize a 10K or summarize an earnings call. In fact, that's an enemy of comprehension. And so I think I and many others sort of push back against the idea that chatbots were transformational to the investment process. We've explored use cases. There's certain sort of targeted use cases. But chatbot was more like a calculator. It's like, question and answer, an active sort of Q&A. It can be helpful for certain things. But like across our client base, we saw very weak adoption of chatbots in the investment process. That flipped immensely from sort of December 25 to spring of 26. Cloud Cowork came out in January 26. I think almost as much as we were pushing back against the role of chatbots in investment process, we're sort of like pushing the gas on agents in the investment process. Now, they're not perfect, but the key thing to me is exactly what you're saying. Like, you can now wrap these agents as an exoskeleton around your investment process. So if you're over 35, it's RoboCop. If you're under 35, it's the Jarvis, your Jarvis suit, Iron Man suit. And so sort of thinking about approaching this cognitively challenged job of investing with the new decision support, the ability to scale depth in a new way. It's so inspiring and amazing to see what people are doing with these tools now. And it's like really just like three or four months old that people are now really adopting agents. And to me, like one of the beliefs I have, strong beliefs about institutional investors, is it has to be hyper personalized to what they're doing. It has to sort of look and feel like their own process. It has to, be trained by their own past trades, their own past earnings previews. That was really conceptual up until like weeks ago. I'm starting to see like build my own demo agents that can see that. I'm like, holy crap, like this is pretty exciting and pretty interesting. So I think we're at this moment now where like it's starting, whatever the endpoint looks like. Is it autonomous hedge funds? Maybe. Is it smaller investment teams? Maybe. Is it the same size investment teams that cover more stocks with more depth and more rigor? Probably. But it sure feels to me like what I'm seeing out there, like things will look quite a bit different in the next 9 to 18 months from sort of across the fundamental equity research process. I think the next 18 months we'll see more change in investment process than I've seen over the last 18 years.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. We're talking to funds that are just launching and they're thinking through what's our data and AI strategy. And one thing that I'm saying now that I used to say the exact opposite of in like just 2023 is like focus on the data. And the reason why I don't say that right now is because you can do so much at inference time that you can really lean on Claude once the data exists and a well thought out way that data needs to be joined together in an MCP server from one of your vendors, that you don't need to build all of that infrastructure up front. Because oftentimes you're going to be hamstrung by the decisions that you make early on before you've even launched on how you think you want your data.
Yeah.
And then when you go to use it, you realize like, oh, there's all of these situations that I didn't think about when I was 9, 12 months pre-launch, that now that I'm in the weeds, I have to deal with what already feels like a legacy system. And I'm just launching. How do I have a legacy system and I'm just launching? And being able, like we've gone through this a couple of times and realizing now you can actually lean on the models at inference time to be able to do the analytics that you want if you can clearly articulate them without ever having to worry about that initial data warehousing effort. Now, it does come in handy so that you don't have to do all of these complex joins as complexity grows, but punt on that complexity in day one. And that's an example of like headcount shrinkage, right? Like you don't need that huge infrastructure team when you're launching. And you see like there were a couple big launches that were a little, maybe 1 or 2 years ahead of their time. When they're like, oh, we can rethink the multi-strat model, and they launch in 2024, beginning of 24. Had they said like, hey, like let's just give it 2 more years and do that same launch in 2026.
Yeah.
I think you would have seen a little bit of different outcomes. But like anyone that launched a fund in 24 and tried to swing for the fences, had they have waited just 1 to 2 more years with what AI is capable of doing, I think you would have seen different outcomes.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's hard to go back. It's hard when you have 100 people to go to 40.
Yes.
It's easier to start with 40 because there are a lot of the cultural consideration Cultural considerations matter. But yeah, I think you'll see some interesting new models around asset management. You're still constrained. Like one of the things I have been just thinking a lot about is just the power law distribution in public markets. You see this, Wall Street Journal had an article on power law distribution in prediction markets. You see this across poker, almost every competitive dynamic, these sort of Pareto distributions where, 5% of bettors on prediction markets are making all the alpha.
Yeah.
And like that's so true in public markets as well too. Like a small percentage of investors are driving all the alpha. You see that in performance of large cap active managers where 90% underperform the benchmark over 10 years. You see it in the high turnover of multis, as you sort of know, like anecdotally, like there's a handful of teams at all these firms that drive a lot of the P&L. And they become bigger and bigger, both AUM. So there is still this skill dynamic that's just inherent in competitive systems that is sort of like it's sort of like the keystone to all of this. Gavin Baker was on a recent podcast and he talked about, Jordan on the Bulls. The Bulls called it a system win, and Jordan says, "No, I'm the star." And then Jordan left, and they haven't won a championship since. And so there's sort of similar dynamic in asset management as well too. It's like that star power, that like special sauce of the investor. If you're automating that person, it's kind of scary to see what could happen. But if you're automating a mortal, the 95% of the rest of us, how does that alpha scale? This has sort of been one of the conundrums of scaling true quantamental businesses, because quant follows the same distribution, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're like marrying fundamental power laws with quantitative signal power laws, like you had better have like sort of top decile alpha and skill in both to sort of bring that combination together. So that hasn't really been realized yet, but it's something I think about a lot as you start to sort of scale these systems up.
Yeah. So with that, Brett, absolute pleasure having you come on the podcast. You're welcome back anytime, by the way. Whenever you're in New York, just let me know. We can do another episode.
All right.
And so for everyone, thanks again for tuning in. Again, I'm your host, Michael Watson. This is the Hedgineer Podcast. We talk about technology, data, and AI, and asset management, hedge funds, prop trading. You can follow us on YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and also join in for the Apple Podcast and Spotify episodes once a week. Until next episode, take it easy.
The Hedgineer Podcast releases episodes weekly on Tuesday. Our hosts are Michael Watson and Jhanvi Virani. The Hedgineer Podcast is produced and edited by Aaron Free. Follow us on your social platform of choice and reach out to us at podcast@hedgineer.io.